Welcome to Boom TV. This is the new episode of the Dem Security podcast of the Regional Center for Democracy and Security, and I am the head of the RCDS, Tigrán Grigoryan. Our guest today is Šíla Փայլան, an international human rights lawyer and a senior fellow at Armenia. Šíla, thanks a lot for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Today we are going to discuss international law in the context of democracy and security nexus. So my first question is a very relevant one. At the time of our recording, Azerbaijan has been misinterpreting and defying the provisional ruling of the International Court of Justice on the Lachin corridor. What does this mean for the international law and for the rules-based order? Is this like a significant violation? What can it lead to something bigger?
So just for background, the ICJ has ordered Azerbaijan effectively to unblock the Lachin corridor in like sort of specific language, and instead of abiding by that order, they sort of enhanced the blockade by setting up an armed checkpoint where the protesters left. So, that's not only whereas before they were interpreting the original order in sort of sneaky ways to say, well, it's not us, we're not the ones doing this, it's the protesters, there's nothing we can do about the protesters. Now they've stepped it up in a way that they're overtly violating the order, they themselves. And so when Armenia asked the court to modify the order to reflect that, the original order is not sufficient, you need to make it more specific to tell the Azerbaijanis to move, the court issued if there's a whole hoopla around the fact that they rejected the request, but it doesn't mean that they did anything to the original order. They reaffirmed it and said that the obligation to not to obstruct the Lachin corridor applies to any circumstance, right? So what this means is, insofar as these violations continue to go unpunished, you can't punish it in the sort of criminal sense, but without consequence, yes, it totally has an a corrosive effect on the power and of not only international law, but the authority of the International Court of Justice. And I would go so far as to say that Azerbaijan is in contempt of the court. Because they are not only deliberately and in bad faith misinterpreting a very clear order, but the effect of doing that is having major humanitarian consequences that, obviously are going to that have a very strong ethnic cleansing component to it.
Are there any other precedents when countries are like openly defying the decisions of the International Court?
Unfortunately, yeah. So, there are plenty, and that doesn't mean that that doesn't. Yeah, and there are plenty that have come with condemnation as well from the Security Council. In this case, we're not getting anything. In the case of the violation of the order with respect to the Lachin corridor. But yes, unfortunately, it's not a unique circumstance that a state refuses to comply. And it doesn't mean that the game is over. The case goes on, and it is also clear in the order that at the end of when the judges decide on the ultimate merits of the case in Armenia's case against Azerbaijan, this issue will arise. This issue, they will determine whether Azerbaijan violated the order, what the consequences were, and how much reparation will need to be made. So, yeah.
Yeah, I see. So let's move to the theoretical part of our discussion. Is there any difference whether a democratic regime or an autocratic regime is trying to use the instruments of international law to promote its security, to enhance its security. Is there academic literature on that? What do the scholars say?
Yeah, there is some. That's a really great question, because, you know, the sort of human rights values-based system arises naturally in the context of democratic systems. You know, democracy and human rights go hand in hand. It doesn't mean that you can't technically have human rights considerations in autocratic systems, but they don't naturally. It's like oil and water, you know, because the whole concept of an autocratic system is based on a ruler that will rule without consideration for without consideration for the rights of people, insofar that as it will, you know, maybe threaten the autocratic order. And there is the international rules-based order we live in is what it is. Like, it exists. These international laws exist. The concepts of customary international law exist. So it's a problem for autocratic states when they don't want to apply it. It's less of a problem for democratic states because they internalize it. You know, like they understand that they have to apply it, and they don't all apply it necessarily fairly, but there's a clear difference between the interpretations of those laws in line with the spirit and object and purpose for which they were created, whereas autocratic states have been using those laws for more illicit purposes. And we do see that, and there are lines of scholarship on it where we see the authoritarianism in international law and the abuse of international law that goes against what it was, you know, created for in the first place. Yes, unfortunately, that's happening more and more.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of incidents when authoritarian states are weaponizing the international law to promote their agenda.
I would say even perverting it. You know, they're abusing it, but in an immoral and perverse way that it's super dangerous. It's really it really is. It sounds, you know, like they're using the jargon. They're saying, well, we are demanding that international law be abided by. For example, Azerbaijan constantly banging on about territorial integrity and sovereignty. Yes, of course, those are international legal principles. They're not the only ones. They're not above and beyond any others. You know, human rights, the right of self-determination, it is way up there. And so it's easy to cherry pick and say, well, we have this right and you did that and the other. But they're looking at it through a lens that has nothing to do with what these rules were created for, and also very conveniently ignoring the fact that rights of humans and lives and the right to live in peace and the right to live in security is the whole reason we have this whole international rules-based order. That's the whole purpose of it. It's not to protect one person's interests over another. It's to protect the lives of the people who live within certain borders.
Yeah, so I have two subsections for my third question. My first question, I think we could have a discussion about that, whether is there something about that. So my first question is about the attempt to force people living in a freer society to integrate into a society which is obviously less fair and is autocratic, is despotic. What does the international law say about that? Are there any regulations? Are there any instruments that can be used to prevent these things from happening?
Yeah, well, that's going to depend, right? So I know what you're saying. You're thinking of the scenario of Nagorno-Karabakh and how it is more democratic and more free than, you know, Azerbaijan proper. And so if we think of the result of reintegration of Nagorno-Karabakh into Azerbaijan ending up with the people of Nagorno-Karabakh living with less rights and less freedoms, it is an extremely unfortunate circumstance. But it's legally, I would say, there's nothing apart from, you know, Azerbaijan being bound to respect the human rights enshrined in the conventions that it has signed on to. it's more of a moral issue than a legal one. Now, it would be different if a sovereign nation invaded another sovereign nation and tried to forcibly integrate it into its, autocratic ways. But it wouldn't be then a question of, is it illegal for a democratic and more free area to be sucked into a more autocratic part? No, there's nothing in law that says you can't do that. Insofar as law, if legally Nagorno-Karabakh is recognized as part of Azerbaijan, Azerbaijan can do whatever it wants within the limits of its obligations under conventions. And, clearly they're not respecting those. But there's, short of, the commission of genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and ethnic cleansing, there is no serious obligation on the international community to intervene in a really coercive way. But we have the ethnic cleansing factor here, so there is, I think,
that was what I was.
But it's not because they're going to become less free and democratic. It's because they're at risk of ethnic cleansing. Yeah. So we will talk about the second subsection of my question, but I would just like to clarify for our listeners and viewers, what are we witnessing now in Nagorno-Karabakh? The blockade, the hate rhetoric, all of that. Does it constitute to ethnic cleansing or a crime against humanity? It's definitely a crime against humanity. It's persecution as a crime against humanity. This is a widespread and systematic attack on a civilian population. Point blank. Nobody says that out loud. It is a total crime against humanity. And there are many more. I would say, you've got the imminent risk of deportation or forcible transfer as a crime against humanity, all kinds of other inhumane acts. So, yes, we are witnessing international relative apathy to a very serious, not just international crime. It's not just a humanitarian crisis. This isn't just about protecting the rights and securities of Armenians. There is, I think, a serious lack of recognition that there is an ongoing international crime happening here.
Yeah.
And because it doesn't look like Rwanda, or it doesn't look like, maybe even Ukraine yet, because bombs aren't dropping. But bombs were dropping not long ago, and there are people dying every week. People are on the brink of starvation. Why do we have to wait until they're emaciated?
Exactly.
It's like, we have to wait. Are we going to do this every time? How many times does this have to happen before we wake up? I don't get it. I mean, I've worked on many conflicts. I've worked on them long after they occurred. Rwanda, former Yugoslavia, Cambodia. I thought we were a little bit further ahead of having to repeat our same mistakes. But unfortunately here, it's definitely happening.
Yeah, I have the same thought whenever I read a piece or I don't know, a piece of information that this power is going to apply sanctions when, I don't know, a bloodshed happens there. Why do you need to wait until something happens? I mean, preventive measures are way more important. And now coming back to the second subsection of my third question.
It sounds like a draft.
Yeah, well, we had some kind of a draft. To be honest, to be perfectly honest. So are autocratic regimes more inclined to get engaged in policies of ethnic cleansing and doing stuff like crimes against humanity?
I mean, I would say that they have less of a buffer or a sort of a stop button, I don't want to believe that we live in any world where people are just constantly naturally inclined to commit crimes. It's not. I want to believe in the goodness of people, even autocratic. But because more democratic, I guess, regimes not only answer to their people large groups of people in whom I believe the goodness, and I believe in the goodness of the Azerbaijani people and the people of any autocratic state. It's not their fault that their leaders are despotic and terrible people, like they are terrible people. Sorry, you're collecting all this money, putting it in your pocket and hurting others in the process. Not fair. But that's like sort of the human drive for greed and the human sad, ability to become desensitized to things like murder or human rights violations or whatever is much more likely in an autocratic state, which functions without limit, which functions freely at the leadership level. And so yes, if ethnic cleansing of a minority group that they don't particularly like because it's causing them trouble is going to solve their problem, they're more likely to do it than a leader of I think a democratic country which has more of an affinity to the human rights values-based system. But it's not black and white. Democratic countries also commit all kinds of terrible crimes or violations. The world is full of them, but at least there are systems for accountability. There are systems for answering to that more in a democratic country where people will wake up and say, hey, this isn't cool, and you can't do that in an autocratic country because then you'll be targeted.
Yeah, and one other point is that in autocratic systems, it's easier to monopolize the media and propaganda resources. Mm-hmm. So it's easier to have some sort of hate narratives being spread, like the things we saw in Rwanda, the things we saw in other autocratic countries. In democracies, you have some sort of plurality in media, you have civil society that could raise questions, unpopular questions. In autocratic regimes, you don't have that. And I would like to end our episode by giving you an opportunity to present your view on the on the relationship between international law and human rights. I know that you're a big proponent of a human-oriented or human rights-oriented approach to the international law. Could you briefly present to our viewers and listeners what does it really mean?
Oh, you want me to sound like a hippie now? Yeah, of course. I in like titles or speeches or whatever, I'll separate international law and human rights. I'll say, I'm an expert in international law and human rights. But human rights is part of international law. It's right up there with all kinds of different areas of international law. And international human rights are as important as the right to, or the principle of territorial sovereignty and integrity. There's no hierarchy there. One is not more important than the other. And yet we've forgotten, we are living in a world where I see a massive digression of human rights, losing so much respect, so much importance and value, because of course it is a dark world that we live in. And so the cynicism that comes with that and the jaded sort of, human rights don't matter. Why do they matter? I get this question a lot. There's a right to peace, It's not enshrined, but it's clear that peace comes with respect for human rights, and we have a right to that. So if we stop taking such a nationalist, territorial-based view of international law as the law that governs the relations between states and start giving human rights the prominence it has, not it deserves, it has, but we're just shoving it to the side because we think land is more important. We think, weaponizing is more important. Who has more weapons? Who has the lives and rights of all humans on this planet need to be not respected in lip service, but in actual hardcore work. So I keep trying to remind and speak of taking a human rights-based approach in scholarship, in advocacy, in in research, and of course in diplomacy. But I don't know why, whereas it comes naturally for me. It's like if someone asks me, why should we care about human rights? I say, well, yeah, why should we care about being a good person?
Yeah.
You know, you're right. Like, what do you mean? Why do human rights matter? I don't know, because we have to share this planet, and we would like it to be a pleasant place to live. That's why, you know. And the further you are from the front line, the more anti-human, like the more sort of realpolitik-y one will get. But those who live under the reign of fire would like nothing more for that to stop. No matter what the land you call it or who's ruling what, just leave me alone, let me graze, let me raise my children, let me eat. So I think it's really important for those of us who are privileged enough to live safe lives, when we opine about this, think about the fact that you are lucky to be safe and have food on your table, and that's why it's important to fight for the rights of others.
Yeah, and a small follow-up question before we finish this episode. Do you think there has been a regress in the international environment about these issues? Because we remember after Rwanda, after Bosnia, we had responsibility to protect, and we had a certain trend towards that direction. But recently, in the last decade, we don't see much of that happening.
Yeah, there is definitely a regression in terms of action taken, real tangible action taken to preserve the rights and lives of humans that doesn't have to do with sending them off to war. So we have a very clear situation right now with 120,000 people whose lives are at serious risk. The UN Security Council unable to do anything about it. Very little, other than just calls and statements. Okay, the ICRC is doing what it can, and very grateful for that. Thank God it exists, But the concepts of why we need to intervene and how all these conversations are still at the highest levels having only to do with territory and not nearly, if you look at the last statement by Charles Michel, the consideration of the rights and security of Armenians is the last. Like, I think it's all the way at the bottom. Am I wrong?
No.
Right. What's at the top? Kilometers.
Square
kilometers.
Yeah.
So I don't understand when that became... Yeah, maybe I don't want to understand. Yes, there's a regression, and it's growing. So I think we all have a responsibility. The international community is not just states; it's also grassroots. It's us, you and me, to try to develop a relationship with what we think rights means and how important we think they are, and then if we agree, then to keep fighting for them.
Sheila, thanks a lot. It was great talk to you as always.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.